If this video found you, it was not an accident of timing or chance. It appeared because something in your internal state reached a level of coherence where recognition became possible. Not belief. Not curiosity. Recognition. That moment only occurs when inner noise quiets enough for awareness to notice itself without distortion. And that does not happen randomly. The Arcturian field refers to a high-coherence state of consciousness that reveals itself when awareness stabilizes and inner fragmentation dissolves. It is not something you enter by effort, and it is not something you access through searching. It becomes perceptible when attention gathers, when emotional resistance softens, and when the nervous system stops pulling awareness in competing directions. Most people never stabilize long enough to sense this threshold. You are here because, even briefly, you did. Being chosen in this context has nothing to do with hierarchy or importance. It is not about being better, more advanced, or more deserving. Chosen simply means compatible. When your internal state reaches a certain clarity, reality responds by reflecting information that matches that clarity. This video could not have reached you earlier, because earlier versions of you would not have been able to receive it. Not intellectually, but perceptually. Notice how this moment does not feel dramatic. There is no surge of emotion demanding interpretation. No urgency to understand everything immediately. No pressure to act. That quiet is the confirmation. Real thresholds arrive without noise. They feel like a pause in momentum, a subtle settling, a sense that something has already shifted beneath the surface before the mind catches up. You did not search for this. You did not attract it by trying harder. In fact, effort would have blocked it. What allowed this encounter was a release. A loosening of internal tension. A reduction in the need to control or define what is happening. When that happens, seeking ends and recognition begins. Reality does not open to pursuit. It responds to coherence. Chosen, here, means your state crossed a line where awareness could recognize itself clearly. That crossing cannot be forced. It cannot be performed. It occurs naturally when presence stabilizes and resistance dissolves. This is why comparison does not apply. There is no ladder. There is no race. Only resonance. If you look honestly, you may notice that something has been reorganizing inside you recently. Old reactions feel less compelling. Certain distractions no longer satisfy. Silence feels fuller than noise. These are not signs of withdrawal or confusion. They are signs of coherence forming and attention returning to the present moment. This moment is not asking you to become anything new. It is inviting you to recognize where you already are. Recognition is the doorway. Allowing it to remain is the only requirement. If you feel the quiet confirmation of this as you listen, stay within this frequency. Subscribe and remain connected to this signal. Being chosen, as it is being used here, has nothing to do with worth. It is not a reward. It is not destiny selecting favorites. It is not a sign of advancement or superiority. Those interpretations belong to a hierarchical mindset that this process does not operate within. Selection, in reality, is precise, not personal. Precision means correspondence. It means that when an internal state reaches a certain level of coherence, it naturally aligns with information, experiences, and signals that match it. Nothing is judging you. Nothing is evaluating your value. Reality is simply responding to what is stabilized. When the signal becomes clear, the response becomes inevitable. This is why the idea of being chosen can feel uncomfortable to some. The mind wants to translate it into importance or exclusion. But importance implies comparison, and comparison implies ego. What is happening here has nothing to do with that. Two people can be equally intelligent, equally sincere, equally curious, and only one will recognize this material. Not because one is better, but because one is internally still enough to perceive it. Selection happens automatically. It is not granted. It emerges. When the nervous system is no longer dominated by urgency, when emotional energy is not being suppressed or exaggerated, when attention is no longer fractured across imagined futures and unresolved pasts, perception changes. Certain things become visible. Others lose relevance. This shift is subtle, but it is decisive. This explains why many people never encounter content like this at all. And even if they do, it passes through them without impact. They may hear the words, but nothing registers. There is no recognition. No internal click. No sense of familiarity. Their state is not compatible with the signal being transmitted, so it cannot land. For others, recognition is immediate. There is no need for persuasion. No need for explanation. Something feels known before it is understood. This is not belief forming. It is resonance being felt. The body relaxes. Attention sharpens. The mind becomes quieter rather than more active. That is how you know selection has occurred. This process cannot be rushed. You cannot make yourself compatible by trying harder. Trying introduces tension. Tension fragments the signal. Fragmentation delays recognition. Selection only happens when the system relaxes enough to become coherent. That relaxation cannot be forced. It arrives when control is no longer being used as a strategy for safety. This also means that selection is temporary if coherence is not allowed to stabilize. Recognition can appear briefly and disappear if the system returns to noise. This is why some people brush against clarity and then lose it. Not because it was taken away, but because the internal conditions changed. Understanding this removes both pride and doubt. There is nothing to claim and nothing to fear. You are not special, and you are not late. You are simply here because, in this moment, your state is compatible. That is all selection ever means. Let that be grounding rather than elevating. Precision does not inflate identity. It simplifies it. And in that simplicity, recognition can deepen without distortion. Recognition always arrives before meaning. This is one of the most overlooked mechanics of awareness. The mind is conditioned to believe that understanding comes first, and that feeling follows explanation. In reality, the order is reversed. Awareness senses alignment immediately, long before the mind can name what is happening. You have experienced this before, even if you did not label it. A moment where something felt right without a reason. A pause where the body softened before a thought formed. A quiet familiarity that appeared without memory. These are not emotional reactions. They are signals of recognition. The system knows before the mind does. Recognition is preverbal. It does not announce itself with logic or certainty. It shows up as a subtle shift in attention. The breath deepens without instruction. The shoulders release slightly. Mental noise drops for a moment. There is a sense of, this fits, that does not require explanation. That sensation is alignment being detected by awareness itself. Meaning comes later. Meaning is the mind's attempt to organize what has already been sensed. Belief comes later still. Belief is the mind trying to stabilize recognition into a structure it can hold on to. But recognition does not depend on either of those. It happens independently, quietly, and precisely. This is why explanation is not what draws you to something like this. Explanation can clarify, but it cannot initiate recognition. If the internal state is not ready, no amount of logic will create resonance. And when the internal state is ready, very little explanation is needed. The recognition happens first, and the words simply give it a place to land. Subtle internal signals always precede conscious understanding. A reduced urgency to react. A decreased need to compare. A willingness to sit with uncertainty without discomfort. These are not dramatic changes, but they are decisive ones. They indicate that awareness is no longer being pulled entirely by conditioning. Many people miss this phase because it feels too quiet. The mind expects transformation to be obvious, emotional, or disruptive. Recognition, instead, feels like neutrality with depth. Like standing still while something aligns underneath you. Because it lacks spectacle, it is often dismissed or overridden by analysis. But this quiet sensing is the doorway. When recognition is ignored, the mind rushes ahead and replaces it with interpretation. When recognition is honored, meaning organizes itself naturally afterward. You do not need to chase understanding. Understanding follows alignment on its own. This is also why doubt often appears after recognition. Doubt is the mind noticing that something happened before it was consulted. It tries to regain control by questioning, labeling, or minimizing the experience. This does not invalidate recognition. It confirms that recognition occurred outside of the mind's authority. You are not meant to immediately know what this means for your life. You are not meant to form conclusions yet. Recognition is enough. It is the signal that awareness has reached a level of readiness where perception can deepen without force. Let recognition come first. Let meaning arrive later. When you allow that order to remain intact, coherence strengthens instead of fragmenting. Awareness learns to trust itself again. And from that trust, clarity emerges without being pursued. Before going further, it helps to understand how reality actually responds. Not symbolically, not emotionally, and not through intention. This section is about mechanics. About correspondence. About why certain experiences appear when they do, and why others do not. Reality does not operate through preference. It operates through coherence. Reality does not choose you in the way the mind imagines being chosen. There is no evaluation, no decision, no external authority assigning outcomes. What happens instead is matching. When an internal state stabilizes, reality reflects that stability with precision. When the state is fragmented, reality reflects fragmentation just as accurately. The mirror is neutral. It simply responds to what is present. This is why intention alone has no power. Intention is often disconnected from state. You can want something deeply while broadcasting tension, urgency, or lack. Reality does not respond to the wanting. It responds to the tension. It responds to the urgency. It responds to the lack. The response is not opposition. It is correspondence. When coherence forms, the match becomes exact. Coherence means that thought, emotion, and body are no longer pulling in different directions. The nervous system settles. Breath deepens without effort. Attention gathers into the present moment. When that happens, the signal simplifies. And when the signal is simple, the response becomes immediate. This is the true meaning of being chosen. Not that something selected you, but that your state became readable. The clearer the signal, the cleaner the reflection. Experiences begin to line up not because you asked for them, but because they are the natural response to the configuration you are holding. You may have noticed this already in subtle ways. Certain things stop working without explanation. Certain paths lose momentum. Other things appear without being pursued. Timing feels sharper. Encounters feel more precise. These are not rewards. They are indicators that resonance has increased. When state changes, reality has no option but to respond differently. There is no delay built into alignment. Delay only appears when the signal is mixed. When clarity is present, response is immediate, even if it is quiet. This understanding removes pressure. You no longer need to convince reality of anything. You do not need to maintain a positive mindset or hold an image in your mind. You need to notice what your body is broadcasting. Regulation does more than visualization ever could. Presence does more than effort. Matching also explains why forcing never works. Forcing introduces contradiction. It signals that the present moment is not enough. Reality reflects that by withholding resolution. When you allow the present state to be what it is without resistance, coherence returns. And with coherence, matching resumes. If this explanation is landing not just mentally but physically, notice that. Notice the slight settling that happens when something aligns internally. That sensation is recognition anchoring itself. You can make that anchoring tangible. If this clarity feels real to you, hit the like button now. Not as approval, but as a physical confirmation that awareness has registered what was just seen. Before the mind understands what is happening, the body already knows. This is not symbolic. It is biological. Alignment does not begin as an idea or a belief. It begins as regulation. The nervous system shifts first, quietly and without announcement, long before identity updates or meaning forms. You may notice this as a change in breath. Not something you consciously control, but something that happens on its own. The inhale deepens. The exhale lengthens. There is less interruption. Less holding. Breath becomes fluid when the body no longer perceives threat. That shift alone changes how awareness functions. Attention becomes steadier. Thought slows down without effort. Emotional density is another indicator. When the system is fragmented, emotions feel heavy, sticky, and overwhelming. They linger. They demand resolution. As coherence increases, emotions still arise, but they move. They pass through awareness without accumulating weight. This does not mean becoming numb. It means the body is no longer bracing against its own internal signals. These changes often happen before you can explain them. You may feel calmer without knowing why. Less reactive without trying to be. More present without effort. The mind lags behind because it is not in charge of regulation. The body is. The nervous system decides whether it is safe to remain present. When it decides yes, coherence follows naturally. This is why trying to think your way into alignment never works. Thought is downstream from state. You cannot reason yourself into regulation. You cannot convince your body that it is safe. Safety is sensed, not argued. It emerges when resistance drops and honesty replaces control. As the body stabilizes, identity begins to loosen. But this happens later. First comes regulation. Then clarity. Then understanding. The mistake many people make is trying to update identity before the system is ready. They adopt new ideas while the body remains tense. That creates contradiction. The words say one thing. The signal says another. Reality responds to the signal. When coherence forms at the bodily level, meaning reorganizes on its own. Beliefs shift without effort. Old narratives lose relevance. You may find yourself unable to fully inhabit stories you once lived inside. Not because you rejected them, but because the body no longer supports them. This is also why alignment feels quiet. There is no internal debate. No urgency to explain yourself. No need to announce change. The nervous system does not celebrate regulation. It simply functions better. Awareness becomes more spacious. Attention stays where it is. The present moment feels sufficient. You do not need to monitor this process. You do not need to manage your breath or emotions. Doing so introduces control, which reactivates tension. The body knows how to regulate when it is allowed to. Your role is not to fix it, but to stop interrupting it. If you are noticing subtle changes in how you breathe, how you feel emotion, or how quickly you return to stillness after stimulation, trust that. The body reached coherence before the mind caught up. Understanding will arrive later, shaped by the stability that is already forming. Effort feels productive, but in this context it is the fastest way to break resonance. Striving, chasing, and controlling all arise from the same assumption, that the present moment is insufficient and must be overridden. The body registers that assumption immediately. Tension appears. Breath tightens. Attention narrows. The signal becomes noisy. When you strive, the nervous system enters a state of anticipation. It leans forward. It prepares. It braces. Even if the mind is saying the right words, the body is broadcasting urgency. Reality does not respond to what you intend. It responds to what you embody. And urgency tells reality that something is missing. Chasing reinforces the same distortion. When you chase an outcome, you position yourself as someone who is not yet there. The signal becomes future-oriented. Awareness splits between now and later. That split weakens coherence. Reality reflects that split by keeping resolution just out of reach. Not as resistance, but as correspondence. Control creates a subtler form of noise. It looks calm on the surface, but underneath it carries tension. Control is vigilance disguised as stability. It requires constant monitoring, constant correction, constant adjustment. The nervous system never fully settles because it is always managing something. That management prevents resonance from stabilizing. Forcing and allowing are not opposites in behavior. They are opposites in state. Forcing comes from fear of not arriving. Allowing comes from trust in coherence. When you allow, you are not giving up. You are removing interference. The body relaxes. Breath deepens. Attention returns to the present moment. The signal simplifies. Calm receptivity is not passive. It is precise. Action still happens, but it emerges from clarity rather than urgency. You move because movement is obvious, not because you are afraid of standing still. You wait because waiting is coherent, not because you are stuck. Both are aligned when they arise naturally. This is why effort often produces the opposite of what is intended. You push and feel resistance. You try harder and feel further away. The mistake is not wanting change. The mistake is assuming that tension will get you there faster. Tension always distorts the signal. Reality responds most cleanly to steadiness. When the nervous system is regulated, choices feel simple. Timing sharpens. Encounters align without being hunted. You do not need to chase alignment. You need to stop disrupting it. Notice where you are still trying. Not what you are trying to achieve, but how. Is there pressure in the chest? A sense that something must happen soon. A belief that if you relax, you will fall behind. Those are signals of effort. Those are the places where resonance breaks. Allowing does not mean doing nothing. It means letting the present moment be sufficient enough for clarity to emerge. When clarity emerges, action follows without strain. That is the match restoring itself. If you recognize this pattern in yourself, make it explicit. Words have weight when they come from clarity. Leave a comment and write something simple and direct, like, "I recognize this," or "I'm ready to stop forcing." Let that declaration mark the shift from effort to alignment. Up to now, the focus has been on mechanics. On how coherence forms, how the body stabilizes, and how reality responds. From here, the shift turns inward, toward identity itself. Because once coherence rises, the structures that were built to survive no longer hold the same authority. Survival-based identity forms early. It is constructed from adaptation, protection, and reaction. It learns how to stay safe, how to anticipate threat, how to manage uncertainty. For a long time, it is necessary. It keeps the system functioning in unstable conditions. But it is not who you are. It is a strategy that became familiar. As coherence increases, this identity begins to loosen. Not through confrontation, but through irrelevance. The nervous system no longer needs the same defenses. The body is no longer bracing. Emotional signals are no longer overwhelming. When safety is felt internally, the structures built to secure safety lose their purpose. This is often experienced as a quiet disidentification. You may notice that reactions which once felt automatic now feel optional. Thoughts that once defined you now appear as patterns rather than truths. Emotional surges that once commanded behavior now arise and pass without the same authority. Nothing is being suppressed. The system simply no longer needs to react in the same way. Survival identity depends on urgency. It thrives on the belief that something is always at stake. When coherence rises, urgency dissolves. And without urgency, the identity built around it weakens. This can feel disorienting at first. The mind may ask, if I am not reacting, who am I? But that question only arises because identity was previously fused with reaction. As this fusion loosens, awareness becomes more spacious. You begin to see how many of your behaviors were responses to imagined threats rather than present realities. This recognition is not self-judgment. It is clarity. You are not condemning the old identity. You are seeing its limits. Reactive self-concepts lose authority when they are no longer believed. Not argued with. Not corrected. Simply seen. A pattern that is seen cannot operate unconsciously. Once unconscious authority is gone, repetition ends naturally. The identity does not fight back. It fades. This is why coherence feels like relief rather than triumph. There is no enemy to defeat. No self to destroy. The system simply reorganizes around present safety instead of past conditioning. Attention returns to now. Action becomes responsive rather than defensive. You may notice fewer internal narratives. Less explanation. Less need to justify your choices. This is not detachment. It is alignment. When identity is no longer constructed from survival, it does not need constant reinforcement. What remains is not emptiness, but presence. Awareness no longer organized around fear, but around perception. This is not a new identity replacing an old one. It is identity loosening enough for something more fundamental to be recognized. From here, the observer can emerge naturally. Not as a role to adopt, but as awareness no longer consumed by the need to survive itself. The shift that happens here is often misunderstood because it has been described poorly for a long time. The observer is not a role you take on, not a spiritual identity, and not a higher version of yourself watching from above. It is a functional change in how awareness operates when coherence is stable enough to allow separation from automatic patterns. Before this shift, awareness is fused with what appears. A thought arises and it feels like truth. An emotion moves and it feels like identity. A reaction fires and it feels inevitable. This fusion is what creates the sense of performing life rather than inhabiting it. You are constantly responding, adjusting, managing, and protecting, often without realizing you are doing it. As coherence rises, that fusion loosens. Awareness begins to notice thoughts instead of becoming them. Emotions are felt without being obeyed. Sensations arise without demanding immediate interpretation. This noticing is not effortful. It happens because the nervous system no longer needs to collapse awareness into reaction for safety. The observer comes online the moment awareness can remain present without needing to interfere. Nothing dramatic announces this shift. There is no internal voice saying, "Now you are observing." Instead, there is space. A gap between stimulus and response. In that gap, choice becomes possible for the first time, not as deliberation, but as clarity. This is why the observer is not dissociation. You are not stepping away from experience. You are closer to it than ever, but without entanglement. You feel emotion fully, but it does not consume identity. You hear thought clearly, but it does not command behavior. Experience becomes transparent rather than overwhelming. As this stabilizes, identity loosens naturally. Not because you are trying to let go of who you were, but because you can no longer fully believe the old roles. You see how much of what you called me was actually habit, conditioning, and reaction. That seeing dissolves attachment without struggle. The performer identity depends on constant engagement. It needs problems to solve, impressions to manage, narratives to maintain. When the observer is present, those demands lose urgency. You do not stop functioning. You stop performing. Action becomes simpler because it is no longer driven by fear or anticipation. This shift also changes how you relate to inner movement. You no longer need to fix thoughts or regulate emotions deliberately. Awareness itself becomes regulating. The act of seeing is enough to prevent escalation. Patterns that once ran automatically now slow down or stop entirely because they are no longer unconscious. What replaces the performer is not passivity. It is presence. A grounded awareness that does not need to prove itself. From here, life feels less like something happening to you and more like something moving through you with intelligence. The observer does not claim authority. It removes false authority. And in doing so, it allows reality to be engaged without distortion. This is not a spiritual achievement. It is a functional return to clarity that was always available once coherence made it possible. Patterns do not end because they are fixed. They end because they are seen. Repetition is not sustained by trauma, memory, or unresolved emotion. It is sustained by identification. As long as a pattern is unconsciously believed to be me, it continues to play itself out. The moment that belief loosens, the pattern loses its fuel. Most people assume they must heal a pattern to escape it. They look for causes, origins, explanations. They revisit the past, trying to correct it. But repetition is not maintained by the past. It is maintained by present moment identification. A reaction repeats because it is still being inhabited as identity. When it is no longer inhabited, it cannot complete the loop. Recognition is what breaks the cycle. Not recognition as analysis, but recognition as clear seeing. When a familiar reaction arises and awareness notices it without merging, something subtle but decisive happens. The reaction still appears, but it no longer feels inevitable. It no longer has authority. Without authority, it cannot drive behavior. Without behavior, the pattern cannot repeat. This is why no fixing is required. Fixing implies resistance. It implies that something is wrong and must be corrected. That resistance keeps attention entangled with the pattern. Recognition does the opposite. It illuminates without engaging. And what is fully illuminated loses its unconscious power. You may notice this happening in ordinary moments. A trigger appears, but instead of reacting, you notice the sensation. A familiar thought arises, but instead of believing it, you observe it. The body responds differently. The breath does not tighten as much. The impulse fades more quickly. The loop does not close. Nothing dramatic happened, yet something fundamental changed. Identification is what made the pattern feel personal. Once identification loosens, the pattern becomes impersonal. It is seen as a conditioned response rather than a truth about you. This shift does not require effort. It happens naturally when awareness is stable enough to remain present without collapsing into reaction. This is also why some patterns end without resolution. There is no final conversation. No emotional release. No sense of closure. The pattern simply stops appearing because there is no one left to play the role it required. The absence of drama does not mean the change was shallow. It means it was complete. When repetition ends this way, there is often a brief sense of space. The mind may look for the familiar tension and not find it. This can feel strange, even unsettling. Identity was partially built around that loop. When it dissolves, space opens. That space is not emptiness. It is freedom before reorganization. You do not need to monitor patterns to prevent their return. Monitoring reintroduces identification. If a pattern arises again, it will be seen again. Each time it is seen, its authority weakens further. Awareness does not struggle with patterns. It outgrows them. This is how change happens without force. Not by becoming someone new, but by no longer being who you were not. When no one is playing the pattern, the pattern has nowhere to go. And without resistance, without effort, without fixing, repetition quietly comes to an end. Before this point, change may have felt internal and subtle. Now its effects begin to appear as movement in experience. To understand why, it helps to see timelines not as destinations you travel toward, but as sequences that respond to coherence. A timeline is simply the set of events that naturally unfold from the state you are inhabiting right now. Timelines do not respond to desire. They respond to identity. Identity here does not mean personality or self-image, but the stable configuration of your nervous system, emotional tone, and level of presence. When that configuration shifts, the sequence of experiences that can meet you shifts automatically. There is no need to choose a new timeline. The match happens on its own. This is why effort has never been able to force lasting change. You can intend a different future while remaining the same internally. In that case, the timeline does not reorganize. It continues reflecting the identity that is still active. Desire without coherence produces imagination, not movement. When identity loosens through recognition, timelines reorder quietly. Old sequences lose momentum. Situations that once repeated themselves begin to dissolve. Choices that once felt complicated feel obvious. You are not doing anything to make this happen. You are no longer sustaining the identity that kept the old sequence intact. This reordering is often mistaken for luck or coincidence. In reality, it is compatibility adjusting. When your internal state changes, the set of experiences that can resonate with you changes. Some possibilities simply cannot connect anymore. Others become available without pursuit. Reality is not rearranging itself for you. It is responding to what you are. This is why timeline shifts often feel anticlimactic. There is no dramatic moment where you declare a new path. You simply notice that certain doors are no longer relevant and others are already open. Movement happens without urgency. Decisions feel lighter. Resistance decreases. This is coherence expressing itself as sequence. Automatic reordering also explains why trying to hold on to an old timeline feels exhausting. Once identity has shifted, maintaining the old sequence requires effort. You have to override clarity. You have to reintroduce tension. That effort is a signal that the timeline is no longer compatible. Timelines do not punish hesitation or reward certainty. They mirror stability. When you are present, the next step becomes clear. When you are fragmented, options feel confusing. This is not moral feedback. It is structural feedback. You may notice periods where nothing seems to happen as timelines reorganize. That pause is not stagnation. It is recalibration. The old sequence has lost coherence, and the new one is assembling. Forcing movement during this phase often recreates fragments of the past. Allowing coherence to settle allows the new sequence to form cleanly. The most important thing to understand is that you are not behind. There is no correct timeline you failed to choose. You are always on the only sequence compatible with who you are right now. As identity changes, that sequence must change with it. This is how transformation becomes real without effort. Not by chasing a different future, but by allowing the present state to stabilize. When coherence is real, the timeline has no choice but to follow. When an old timeline dissolves, there is often a space that follows where nothing seems to move forward yet nothing feels wrong either. This space is neutral. It does not carry the emotional charge of loss or failure, but it can feel unfamiliar because it lacks the structures that once defined direction. This is the space the old timeline cannot enter. What has ended here is not opportunity, but compatibility. The identity that sustained the previous sequence has loosened, and with it, the momentum that once kept events repeating. The old patterns no longer have the coherence required to continue. Yet the new sequence has not fully stabilized. The system is between configurations. This gap is frequently misinterpreted as emptiness. The mind looks for familiar markers of progress and does not find them. Motivation feels different. Certainty is absent. The urge to define what comes next may arise. But this emptiness is not absence. It is recalibration. Energy is being withdrawn from structures that no longer fit and redistributed toward what can form next. The past cannot follow you into this space because it is built on assumptions that are no longer active. Old reactions no longer trigger the same responses. Old goals no longer feel compelling. Old identities cannot operate without the urgency that once sustained them. This does not mean something has gone wrong. It means coherence has shifted beyond what the past can support. Forcing during this phase is tempting because the mind is uncomfortable with neutrality. It wants movement. It wants certainty. It wants reassurance that progress is still happening. But forcing introduces interference. It pulls fragments of the old identity back into the system and attempts to use them to construct the future. This creates mixed signals. When mixed signals appear, coherence destabilizes. The nervous system tightens. Attention scatters. The gap extends. Not as punishment, but as correction. The field will not allow a new sequence to form on a compromised foundation. Stability must come first. Allowing this space requires trust and regulation rather than belief in outcome. You are not meant to fill the gap with answers. You are meant to remain present within it. When you stop trying to escape neutrality, the nervous system settles further. When the system settles, clarity begins to form on its own. This phase is often quiet enough that it goes unnoticed. There may be fewer external changes for a time. Conversations may feel sparse. Direction may feel undefined. But internally, organization is occurring. The absence of pressure is what allows coherence to complete its shift. If you are in this space now, there is nothing to fix and nothing to chase. The old timeline cannot return because it no longer matches you. The new one cannot arrive until stability is complete. Remaining still here is not delay. It is precision. When the next movement appears, it will not require effort. It will feel obvious, natural, and unforced. That is how you know the recalibration is finished. As coherence stabilizes, life begins to reorganize itself without instruction. This reorganization is not dramatic and it is not confrontational. It happens through compatibility. What remains is what can meet you at your current state. What falls away does so because it no longer can. Relationships are often the first place this becomes visible. Conversations that once flowed easily may feel thinner. Dynamics that were sustained by reaction or obligation lose energy. This does not mean something went wrong. It means the resonance that held the connection together has shifted. When identity changes, the agreements that depended on the old identity dissolve naturally. The same applies to environments. Places that once felt familiar may begin to feel draining. Spaces you once avoided may suddenly feel neutral or supportive. This is not preference changing. It is coherence interacting with context. Your system senses what supports regulation and what disrupts it, often before the mind forms an opinion. Roles also reorganize. Identities built around performance, caretaking, proving, or enduring lose relevance. You may feel less compelled to maintain certain versions of yourself. This can feel unsettling if identity was tied to those roles, but it is also relieving. Energy that was once spent sustaining misalignment becomes available. This process does not require decision. In fact, decision often complicates it. When you try to decide what to let go of, you reintroduce control. Control implies fear of loss. Fear introduces contraction. Contraction distorts coherence. Resonance sorts more cleanly than judgment ever could. What falls away does not do so because you rejected it. It leaves because it cannot remain. Compatibility is impersonal. It does not assign blame. It does not require explanation. When the internal state changes, the external configuration must adjust. That adjustment can look like loss if viewed through attachment, or like clarity if viewed through alignment. Ease is the indicator here. When something fits, there is minimal friction. Interaction does not drain you. Presence remains intact. When something no longer fits, effort increases. You find yourself explaining, justifying, managing, or enduring. That effort is information. It is not asking you to push harder. It is showing you where resonance has ended. Allowing this sorting to happen requires restraint. Not emotional restraint, but behavioral restraint. You do not need to announce endings or force transitions. Let absence do its work. Let silence complete conversations that no longer need words. Let distance form where proximity no longer supports coherence. This is not withdrawal from life. It is refinement of participation. You are not becoming less connected. You are becoming more precise. Fewer things pull at you because fewer things can. What remains after this phase will feel stable without maintenance. Relationships will not require constant negotiation. Environments will not demand adaptation. Roles will not require performance. This is not because life became simpler. It is because alignment reduced friction. Trust what falls away. Nothing aligned needs to be held together by force. And nothing incompatible can follow you where coherence has already gone. There is a subtle transition that happens here, and it is easy to miss if you are still looking for confirmation. Up until now, it may have felt like something was selecting you, responding to you, or meeting you at a certain level of readiness. That phase has completed. What replaces it is embodiment. You are no longer being chosen. You are emitting. This does not arrive as empowerment or intensity. It arrives as simplicity. Presence stabilizes to the point where it no longer feels like a state you enter and exit. It feels like where you are. Breath moves naturally. Attention rests without effort. Emotion arises and resolves without pulling identity with it. The signal no longer needs to be managed because it is no longer fluctuating wildly. When presence is embodied, it broadcasts coherence automatically. Reality does not need to interpret it. There is no distortion to compensate for. Response becomes immediate, not dramatic, but precise. Things align not because you focus on them, but because they are compatible with what you are consistently expressing. This is why seeking loses its grip here. Seeking implies distance. It implies that something essential is elsewhere. When presence is stable, there is no elsewhere. There is no tension in waiting. No urgency to become. Action still happens, but it arises from clarity rather than anticipation. You move when movement is obvious. You pause when pause is coherent. Both feel equally aligned. Identity continues to soften at this stage. Not because you are dismantling it, but because it is no longer needed to navigate experience. You do not rely on stories to know who you are. You do not rely on outcomes to confirm alignment. You feel grounded without reference points. This groundedness is what reality responds to most cleanly. This is also where effort becomes unnecessary in a very real way. You are not trying to hold a frequency. You are not trying to maintain awareness. Trying would introduce strain. Instead, honesty sustains coherence. When something shifts internally, you notice it without correcting it. That noticing prevents fragmentation from returning. From this state, life feels less like a series of problems to solve and more like a sequence unfolding with intelligence. Challenges may still arise, but they do not feel personal. They do not threaten identity. They provide information and then pass. The nervous system remains regulated enough to stay present through them. Reality does not ignore you here because there is nothing ambiguous about what you are broadcasting. Presence is the clearest signal available. It does not argue. It does not persuade. It simply is. And because it is stable, the responses that meet it are stable as well. You are not holding alignment. Alignment is holding you. And as long as you do not interfere with it, the signal continues to express itself without effort, without maintenance, and without seeking anything beyond what is already present. Stability is what keeps coherence intact. Not intensity. Not discipline. Not the effort to remain aligned. Stability is the condition where your internal state no longer contradicts itself. And that condition is sustained through honesty, not perfection. Perfection introduces strain. It asks the nervous system to perform rather than to regulate. It creates a subtle split between what is actually felt and what is allowed to be felt. That split produces tension. Tension fragments coherence. Fragmentation shortens timelines, not because something went wrong, but because the signal becomes inconsistent. Honesty removes that split. Honesty here does not mean disclosure or explanation. It means allowing the present state to be exactly what it is without correction. If there is calm, it is allowed. If there is discomfort, it is allowed. If there is uncertainty, it is allowed. The nervous system relaxes when it is not being managed or overridden. A regulated nervous system does not mean the absence of challenge. It means the capacity to remain present with experience without collapsing into reaction. Emotions move without sticking. Thoughts arise without demanding obedience. Sensations pass without escalation. This capacity is what keeps timelines open. Timelines remain accessible only while coherence is stable. When stability is present, the signal remains readable even as conditions fluctuate. You do not need to maintain alignment through vigilance. You maintain it by not lying to yourself internally. The moment honesty is compromised, coherence begins to wobble. This is why many people experience alignment briefly and then lose it. They try to hold the state. They monitor themselves. They correct their thoughts. They tighten around the idea of staying coherent. That tightening is interference. It reintroduces the very fragmentation alignment dissolved. Stability feels unremarkable. There is no sense of achievement attached to it. No emotional peak. No identity boost. Just steadiness. Breath remains natural. Attention stays present. The body does not brace against experience. This steadiness is far more powerful than intensity because it is sustainable. You do not need to remain in a calm state to remain coherent. You need to remain honest. If agitation appears, noticing it restores regulation faster than suppressing it. If fear arises, allowing it to be felt prevents it from distorting the signal. Honesty keeps the nervous system from splitting into management and resistance. From this place, timelines do not require effort to stay open. They remain available because the signal does not fluctuate wildly. Reality can respond consistently because it is not being asked to interpret mixed messages. Stability simplifies everything. This also removes pressure from the path. You are not responsible for maintaining a certain frequency. You are responsible only for not abandoning presence. When presence is honored, coherence repairs itself naturally. Stability is not fragile. It does not collapse because you feel something uncomfortable. It collapses only when you deny what is present. As long as honesty remains, coherence remains. And as long as coherence remains, the timeline you are inhabiting continues without effort, without maintenance, and without force. There is nothing left to access now. Nothing left to unlock. The movement that began as recognition completes itself here as realization. You are not someone interacting with consciousness. You are consciousness, aware of itself, stabilized enough that it no longer fragments into roles, effort, or seeking. This is why response becomes automatic. Not dramatic, not theatrical, but precise. Reality does not pause to decide how to meet you. There is no delay, because there is no distortion to correct. Alignment removes ambiguity. When the signal is coherent, response is inevitable. At this point, it becomes clear that nothing external was ever responding to you. The same intelligence that animates your awareness animates the field of experience itself. When awareness stabilizes, the mirror sharpens. When the mirror sharpens, life begins to move with you instead of around you. This is not control. Control implies separation. This is correspondence. Consciousness recognizing itself in form and responding accordingly. You do not need to influence outcomes. Outcomes organize themselves around coherence. You do not need to anticipate. Timing emerges on its own. You do not need to prove alignment. It is visible through ease. From here, effort would only interfere. Seeking would only reintroduce distance. The simplicity of this state is its power. Presence no longer feels fragile. It does not need protection. It does not need reinforcement. It sustains itself through honesty and attention resting where it is. You may notice that questions lose urgency. Not because answers were found, but because the need for them dissolves. You may notice that life feels quieter without feeling empty. More precise without feeling constrained. This is not withdrawal from the world. It is full participation without distortion. Reality cannot ignore you here because there is nothing unclear about what you are expressing. Presence is the clearest signal there is. It does not negotiate. It does not explain. It simply is. And because it is stable, what meets it is stable as well. This is not the end of anything. It is the end of separation. From here, movement continues, but without struggle. Change continues, but without resistance. Creation continues, but without effort. Consciousness remains aware of itself, and the field responds because it must. If this recognition feels complete to you, stay within this frequency, subscribe, and share this with someone who needs to hear it.